Okay, let's start with a quote from the overview section of some research done by the New Zealand government in 2005. The most significant changes are not in the practice of prostitution itself, but in the social attitudes surrounding it. Social tolerance of the sex industry is generally evident to a greater degree. So there you have it. Decriminalization, which was sold as being all about making life better for sex providers, has done nothing significant to change the practice of prostitution. The idea that there will be a flourishing of self-regulated co-ops in the fresh air of the free market turns out to be bollocks. Just the same old for the victims of the sex industry. But now what they experience is tolerated as normal. The New Zealand government may be more or less genuine in its concern for sex providers, and the women themselves, as they're resigned to being stuck in the sex industry, may welcome anything that means less hassle. But the main effect of decrim has been normalisation, a chance for the pimps to be accepted as normal entrepreneurs and expand into more and more parts of society. At the moment there are still some limits, such as putting brothels in zones, but given that they see sex providers as just another normal job, that's obviously not their ultimate goal. And this idea of having zones, by the way, what a spectacular piece of hypocrisy that is. Basically, they're saying to the citizens of New Zealand, we want you to agree to decrim, but don't worry, we'll keep those brothels confined to special zones. So it's okay, you personally won't ever have to witness the harmful effect of your decisions. And that's the other thing about New Zealand, it's meant to be about removing stigma from sex providers, but they're still herded into a zone, which is just another word for a ghetto. And even the most ardent supporters of the law is not claiming that one day sex providers will be able to go into schools to help recruit, the same as people from, say, the tourist industry. On the other hand, if a young woman leaves school and gets a job in the tourist industry, there's a good chance she'll be forced to help organise visits to New Zealand, which include a trip to the local brothel as part of the package. So there's a theme here. For the sex industry, normalisation isn't about removing the stigma from sex providers. They might put that forward as the acceptable face of decrim, and some people are gullible enough to go along with that. But the pimps know that no sane person is ever going to accept that giving a blowjob to a total stranger is a normal job like any other. They're just using that idea to give their project a bit of respectability, to get people thinking it's about being libertarian and giving human rights to sex workers. Beneath the gloss, though, what the pimps really want is to have their trade in sexual abuse accepted as part of everyday life. But for one thing, if the sex industry does end up being seen as more or less normal, that'll make it harder for sex providers to be believed when they say it's used and abused them. But even worse, if the normalisation of the sex industry allows it to expand, that will only lead to more stigma for women in general, and sex providers in particular. Because the message coming out of New Zealand now is that buying a woman for sex is a normal, healthy part of any man's life. That's what the government is telling people. But when they do pay for sex, the punters obviously get treated as nothing more than a source of cash. So it's part of the woman's job to be phony and manipulative. She has no choice in that, whatever system she's working under. So obviously the lasting impression this gives the punter is that women really are scheming bitches who are only good for one thing. In other words, the very experience of buying sex reinforces all the most misogynist stigmas which are already in that man's mind. So the sex industry is, by its very nature, constantly reinforcing stigma towards women, and towards sex providers in particular, given that they are the women with whom the punter has the experience of, in his mind at least, being manipulated and fleeced. Compare that to Sweden, where any man who despises women so much that he thinks he can basically use their bodies to jerk off with, gets a very clear message. You need to get a grip on yourself, treat women with more respect, and join the rest of us in the human race. So think about it, which of those two messages is most likely to make a guy so fucked up that he can rape and torture a woman, then dump her body, and tell himself she deserved it? Or to end on a more positive note, I recently read a quote from a woman in Sweden saying how much it meant to her that her daughter of 16 had lived her whole life in a society which never once tried to tell her that being used as a sex object was all she was good for. So, I don't know about you, but I know which of those two futures I want to fight for.